Hey guys, tonight we journey into the smoky, sticky, and surprisingly dangerous world of medieval taverns. Those legendary gathering places where ale flowed like rivers, strangers became friends or enemies, and the line between civilization and chaos was as thin as watered-down beer. But forget everything you think you know from fantasy movies and video games. The real medieval tavern was a place where survival meant more than just avoiding food poisoning. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this, you're trudging through the muddy streets of 14th century London, your boots squelching through a mixture of horse dung, rotting vegetables, and things you'd rather not identify. The rain has been falling for 3 days straight. Your stomach growls with hunger, and your throat burns with thirst that water alone cannot quench. In the distance, through the grey mist, you see it. A wooden sign creaking in the wind, painted with a crude image of a boar's head or grapes. Warm firelight spills from small windows, and sounds of laughter and singing drift through the heavy wooden door. You found a tavern. And whether you know it or not, you're about to enter a world that operates by its own rules. The medieval tavern wasn't just a place to drink. It was the beating heart of community life, the unofficial town hall, employment office, and entertainment center all rolled into one smoky, chaotic institution. But it was also a place where danger lurked in every shadow, where disease spread faster than gossip, and where the unwary could lose everything before the night was through. Tonight, we're pulling back the romantic veil that centuries of storytelling have draped over these establishments. We'll discover what you'd really eat and drink, who you'd meet, what games you'd play, and most importantly, how you might survive the experience. The sensory assault. The first thing that would hit you upon entering wasn't the sight or sound, it was the smell. A complex assault of unwashed humanity mixed with sour ale, acrid smoke from poorly ventilated fires, and mysterious fermented odors from dark corners. The floors were typically packed earth covered with rushes, long grasses supposed to absorb spills. In theory, these were changed regularly. In practice, they remained for months, slowly composting into a rich ecosystem of decomposing matter, spilled food, and occasional small corpses of vermin. Walking across these floors was like traversing a spongy, unpredictable landscape. The walls, constructed of wattle and daub, mud, straw, and animal dung, were blackened with smoke and grease. They sweated moisture in winter and radiated heat in summer. The ceiling, low and oppressive, pressed down like a physical weight. Massive wooden beams supported the structure, and from them hung dried herbs, strings of onions, sides of bacon, and sometimes the less savory remnants of customers who had failed to pay their debts. Lighting came from the great hearth, its flames casting dancing shadows. Candles provided additional illumination, but their flickering light only added to the sense of unease. The smoke had nowhere to go but up, collecting under the low ceiling before finding its way through gaps in the thatch. Every breath was an adventure. The air was thick enough to chew, laden with soot, grease, and exhalations of dozens who considered bathing a seasonal activity at best. Yet for all its assault on the senses, there was something undeniably alive about a medieval tavern. The very air pulsed with raw vitality, humanity stripped of pretense. As your eyes adjusted, you began to make out the figures populating this smoky underworld. Merchants counting coins with suspicious eyes. Soldiers wearing mud of distant battlefields. Pilgrims seeking shelter. Craftsmen celebrating. And locals who seemed to have grown from the floorboards themselves. The tavern keeper presided over this chaos like a king. His word was law within these walls, and his justice was swift and brutal. He knew every customer's name, their debts, their secrets, and their weaknesses. Establishments, a hierarchy of hospitality. Not all medieval drinking establishments were equal. Understanding the differences between an inn, a tavern, and an ale house could mean the difference between a comfortable night and waking up in a ditch. At the top stood the inns, designed primarily to house travelers, offering beds or at least something resembling beds. The better inns were substantial buildings, often stone, with multiple stories. The Tabard Inn in Southwark, immortalized by Chaucer, was one such establishment where travelers could expect victuals of the best and strong wine. But even the finest inns had peculiarities that would shock us today. Privacy simply did not exist. Travelers were packed into rooms like cargo, 10 or 12 strangers sharing not just space, but often the same bed. The beds themselves were rope or leather straps across wooden frames, supporting mattresses stuffed with straw or feathers. These mattresses were home to entire ecosystems of fleas, lice, and bedbugs. Taverns occupied the middle ground. Originally the domain of vintners, wine merchants who sold their wares directly to the public. Wine was expensive, imported from France or Spain, carrying an air of sophistication that ale could never match. A gallon of decent red wine might cost 3 pennies, twice the price of finest ale. Wine trade was heavily regulated. Adulteration was common, unscrupulous keepers watering down wine or creating counterfeit versions. Penalties were severe. A keeper caught selling adulterated wine might find himself in the pillory with the offending liquid poured over his head. As taverns evolved, they expanded offerings beyond wine. Cider, perry, and mead all found their way onto tavern tables. Many began offering food and rooms for rent, blurring the lines between taverns and inns. At the bottom were ale houses, humble establishments that began as private homes where housewives brewed more ale than families could consume. These alewives would signal fresh ale by hanging a stick or broom outside their door. Ale was medieval society's lifeblood, consumed by everyone from infants to elderly because it was often safer than water. The brewing process killed harmful bacteria. A typical alewife might brew several times weekly, producing ale lasting only days before souring. Despite humble origins, ale houses were subject to strict regulation. The assize of bread and ale enacted in 1266 tied ale prices to wheat prices and established quality standards. Ale conners tested ale and ensured quality. Punishments for brewing bad ale were severe and public. Brewers might be locked in the pillory or dunked repeatedly in water. The drink of survival. In a world where water could kill you faster than your enemies, alcohol wasn't luxury, it was necessity. The Thames in London was a flowing cocktail of human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff. Wells were frequently contaminated. Even rainwater quickly became breeding grounds for bacteria. The solution was alcohol. Brewing required boiling water and produced ethanol, killing most harmful microorganisms. This led to a society where alcohol consumption began at birth and continued until death. Infants received weak ale or watered wine. Children drank small beer. Adults consumed stronger versions throughout the day. Brewing ale was primarily women's work. An alewife's reputation rested on producing consistent, flavorful ale. Basic ingredients were simple: malted barley, water, and gruit, a mixture of herbs and spices. But simplicity in ingredients didn't mean simplicity in execution. The result bore little resemblance to modern beer. Medieval ale was cloudy, often thick enough to chew, with complex flavor profiles. It was typically consumed within days of brewing. Alcohol content varied widely from weak small beer to stronger versions that could leave a man senseless. Wine occupied a different niche. Where ale was the common drink, wine carried connotations of sophistication and wealth. The Church's use of wine in communion gave it sacred quality. England's wine came primarily from continental possessions. Gascon wine was most common, Rhenish wine more expensive but prized for quality. Wine merchants were among the wealthiest members of medieval society. But wine's prestige made it a target for fraud. Unscrupulous merchants might water down wine, mix varieties, or create counterfeit wines using various ingredients. Mead, made from fermented honey, occupied a special place, often called the drink of gods, associated with celebration and warrior culture. It was expensive to produce but worth the cost for special occasions. Cider and perry were regional specialties reflecting local agriculture. The questionable cuisine. If drink was questionable, food was often downright dangerous. Yet for many, the tavern meal was the best they could hope for. The centerpiece was pottage, a thick stew that could contain virtually anything edible. Take a large cauldron, fill it with water or broth, add whatever ingredients were available, and simmer until tender. The perpetual stew or hunter's pot was kept simmering constantly, with new ingredients added as old ones were consumed, a breeding ground for bacteria and repository for ingredients of questionable origin. The base was grain, barley, oats, wheat. Vegetables were added when available. Meat, when it appeared, was often of uncertain origin and questionable quality, typically tough, stringy, and well past its prime. Tavern keepers weren't above using meat rejected by other buyers, animals that had died of disease, or cut sitting in the market for days. Fish was common, especially during Lent, but medieval preservation was primitive. Fish that had traveled any distance was heavily salted, dried, or pickled. Fresh fish was a luxury that had to be consumed quickly. The cooking process itself was fraught with hazards. Great cauldrons were difficult to clean thoroughly. Fires were smoky and unpredictable. Stirring was done with wooden spoons that might not be cleaned between uses. Bread was the other staple, but quality varied enormously. The best taverns served white wheat bread, soft and relatively fresh. More commonly, customers received brown bread made from barley or rye, often days old and hard as a weapon. The worst bread was mixed with sawdust, ground acorns, or other fillers. Cheese, eggs, and vegetables rounded out the menu. Preservation was a constant challenge without refrigeration. Food preparation was communal, with cross-contamination inevitable. Raw meat might be prepared on the same surface as bread. Despite all challenges, tavern food served important social and nutritional functions. For many, especially city dwellers, it was their primary source of hot cooked food. It was also a social experience, creating opportunities for conversation and community building. The Rogues Gallery. Step into any medieval tavern and you'd find yourself surrounded by a cast of characters that would make a crime novelist weep with envy. Merchants were perhaps most visible, natural storytellers regaling anyone who would listen with tales of distant markets and road perils. But beneath jovial exteriors lay sharp minds constantly calculating profit, and eyes that missed nothing of value. Successful merchants were walking advertisements for prosperity, but this made them targets for every cutpurse and robber in the establishment. Soldiers could either ensure peace or guarantee trouble. Veterans brought scars, stories, and casual attitude toward violence that could turn disagreement into bloodbath. They were skilled with weapons and often suffering from what we'd now recognize as PTSD. The worst were little better than bandits with military training. Pilgrims represented a different danger, not physical violence but moral corruption. Some were genuine seekers, but others used pilgrimage as excuse for adventure or escape from legal troubles. Chaucer's pilgrims included a corrupt pardoner selling fake relics and a summoner taking bribes, people who manipulated religious sentiment for personal gain. Craftsmen and artisans were the economy's backbone. Guild membership gave them status and protection, but also created rivalries that could spill into violence. The most dangerous were those expelled from guilds. They had skills but no legitimate way to use them. Clergy were surprisingly common despite church disapproval. Some were genuinely pious men with no other option for shelter. Others used religious status as cover for less holy activities, selling false indulgences, performing illegal marriages, or providing sanctuary to criminals for payment. Women occupied complex and dangerous positions. Alewives were businesswomen but vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft or adultery. Serving wenches faced constant harassment and threat of sexual violence. But medieval women were not passive victims, many were skilled with knives and poisons, and often more ruthless than male counterparts when threatened. Thieves and cutpurses were most obvious criminals but also most skilled at blending in. Professional thieves were indistinguishable from honest merchants until they struck. They often worked in teams, with one creating distraction while another picked pockets. The tavern keeper himself was often the most dangerous person in the establishment. He controlled the environment, knew all customers, and had authority to settle disputes. But he was also a businessman operating in a legal gray area, and his survival depended on balancing competing interests. Games of chance and ruin. In flickering candlelight, fortunes were won and lost with dice rolls, card turns, or contests of skill and luck. Gambling wasn't just entertainment, it was a way of life, means of social advancement, and often a path to ruin. Dice were most popular, small, portable, made from bone, wood, or stone. The most common game was hazard, a precursor to modern craps. But medieval dice games were wild, unpredictable affairs where rules changed with players and cheating was considered an art form. The dice themselves were often works of art, carved from exotic animal bones or precious materials. But all dice were suspect. Loaded dice, shaved dice, and dice with duplicate numbers were common. The most skilled players could cheat without detection. Cards, though less common than dice, were growing in popularity. Medieval card games bore little resemblance to modern poker. Primero, an ancestor of poker, involved betting on hand strength but with different rankings and more fluid betting structure. The most dangerous aspect wasn't the games themselves but accusations of cheating. Proving cheating was difficult and often led to violence. A player accused might face not just loss of winnings but a knife in the ribs. Beyond dice and cards, taverns hosted bewildering variety of gambling activities. Arm wrestling, drinking competitions, tests of skill, anything with uncertain outcome could become a wager. Cockfighting was particularly popular, with brutal fights often ending in death of one or both birds. Professional gamblers traveled tavern to tavern, making their living from skill at games of chance. They were welcomed by tavern keepers because they attracted customers, but viewed with suspicion by local players. The best professionals could lose gracefully when necessary, winning just enough to make a living without arousing too much resentment. When violence erupts. Violence in medieval taverns wasn't an aberration, it was integral to the social fabric. In a world where might often made right and personal honor was worth more than life itself, the tavern served as both pressure valve and proving ground. Honor was medieval society's currency, and it could be devalued by a single moment of perceived cowardice or disrespect. A man who allowed himself to be insulted without response might find his reputation permanently damaged. In this context, violence wasn't just an option, it was often the only option for maintaining one's place in society. The weapons available were limited, but creativity could turn almost anything into an instrument of death. Knives were most common, carried by virtually everyone for eating and utility. These weren't small table knives but substantial blades capable of inflicting serious wounds. More commonly, fighters made do with improvised weapons. Wooden stools became clubs, pottery shards became cutting implements, and heavy pewter tankards were effective as bludgeons, capable of crushing skulls. Fighting styles were brutal and practical, focused on ending conflicts quickly. Grappling, gouging, biting, and kicking were all acceptable. The goal wasn't to wound or disable but to kill or incapacitate before your opponent could do the same. Group fights were particularly chaotic. What might start as a dispute between two individuals could quickly escalate into a melee involving dozens. Alliances formed and dissolved in seconds as customers chose sides based on personal relationships or simple proximity. Women's role in tavern violence was complex and often underestimated. While less likely to engage in direct confrontation, they were often instigators, using relationships with men to manipulate conflicts. When women did engage in violence, they were often more vicious and unpredictable. Female tavern keepers maintained order through intimidation and violence, wielding kitchen implements with deadly efficiency. The aftermath was often as dangerous as the violence itself. Wounded fighters might die from injuries days later, turning minor altercation into murder. Families might seek revenge, creating cycles of violence persisting for generations. But violence also served important social functions. It established and maintained social hierarchies. It was entertainment for spectators. It was a method of dispute resolution in a society where formal legal mechanisms were often unavailable. Justice and corruption. Justice in medieval taverns was a complex affair where official law enforcement competed with unofficial systems of order, and the line between legal authority and criminal enterprise was blurred beyond recognition. The most visible representatives were constables and bailiffs, often part-time officials who combined law enforcement with other occupations. Their effectiveness varied widely based on personal courage, political connections, and financial resources. The crimes officials were most concerned with were those threatening public order or royal authority. Treason, sedition, and political crimes were taken very seriously, as were violent crimes resulting in serious injury or death. But many activities that would be criminal today were either legal or tolerated. Gambling was officially prohibited but widely practiced and rarely prosecuted. The church had its own system of law enforcement operating parallel to secular authorities. Canon law governed marriage, sexual behavior, and religious observance. Taverns were particular targets because they were associated with many activities the church considered sinful. Guilds provided another layer of law enforcement. They had authority to regulate members' business practices, set prices and quality standards, and punish violations. The most effective law enforcement was often the informal system exercised by the tavern keeper and regular customers. A strong tavern keeper maintained order through personal authority, physical intimidation, and economic incentives. This informal system operated according to its own rules. Disputes might be settled through negotiation, compensation, or ritualized combat. Corruption was endemic. Officials might accept bribes to overlook illegal activities, participate in profits of criminal enterprises, or use authority to extort money. The most corrupt officials engaged in criminal activities themselves while using legal authority to cover up their crimes. Trials were often public spectacles serving as much to entertain as to determine guilt. The accused might undergo various forms of ordeal: trial by combat, trial by fire, believed to reveal divine judgment. These procedures were based on religious beliefs rather than rational investigation. Punishments were designed to serve multiple purposes: deterrence, retribution, and public entertainment. Public executions, floggings, and corporal punishment were common. But punishment was highly variable and often arbitrary. The same crime might result in a small fine for a wealthy merchant and death for a poor peasant. The morning after. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of gray and gold, taverns that had pulsed with life throughout the night began their slow transformation back to something resembling respectability. But evidence of the previous evening's activities lingered: bloodstains on floors, broken furniture in corners, and hollow-eyed stares of those who had gambled away their futures. The morning after was when the true cost of tavern life became apparent. Bodies had to be removed, some merely unconscious from drink, others permanently silenced by violence. Debts had to be collected or forgiven. Reputations had to be rebuilt or abandoned as word spread through the community. For the tavern keeper, morning brought grim arithmetic of profit and loss. How much had been earned? How much lost to theft, damage, and unpaid bills? How many customers gained or lost based on the night's events? The cleanup process was both physical and social. Floors had to be swept, furniture repaired, supplies replenished. But more importantly, relationships had to be mended, alliances renegotiated, and the complex web of obligations holding the tavern community together had to be rewoven. The customers who had survived faced their own reckonings. Merchants assessed whether their business dealings had been profitable or disastrous. Soldiers determined whether their reputations had been enhanced or damaged. Craftsmen returned to workshops trying to focus despite hangovers, injuries, and lingering effects of whatever substances they'd consumed. But perhaps the most profound reckoning took place in minds and souls of those who had participated. In harsh light of day, actions that had seemed reasonable in flickering candlelight might appear sordid or shameful. Promises made in passion or fog of drink might prove impossible to keep. The church offered its own reckoning through confession. Priests who had themselves been tavern patrons might find themselves hearing confessions from fellow customers, creating a complex web of shared guilt and mutual absolution. The economic reckoning was perhaps most immediate. Debts incurred during a night of gambling or drinking had to be paid, often with interest and penalties that could quickly spiral out of control. Families might find themselves impoverished by a single night's poor decisions. The social reckoning was more subtle but equally important. Reputations built over years could be destroyed in a single evening. Marriage prospects might be improved or ruined. Business relationships might be strengthened or severed. The cycle of tavern life was relentless and self-perpetuating. Each night brought new customers seeking the same things: food, drink, companionship, excitement, and possibility of changing circumstances through luck or skill. Each morning brought the same reckonings. The lasting legacy. The filthy truth about medieval taverns was that they were simultaneously the best and worst of their world. Places of genuine community and brutal exploitation, of authentic human connection and calculated manipulation, of liberation from social constraints and enslavement to human weakness. They were institutions that revealed the full spectrum of human possibility, from the sublime to the ridiculous, from the heroic to the criminal, from the sacred to the profane. They provided spaces where people could be fully human, with all the messiness and contradiction that entails. The medieval tavern stands as testament to resilience and adaptability of human society. Despite all dangers, contradictions, and moral compromises, these institutions survived and thrived because they met real human needs in ways no other institution could match. The tavern door swings shut one final time. The fire burns down to embers, and the last customer stumbles into the dawn. But the stories continue, passed down through generations, reminding us that in every age, there are places where the human drama plays out in all its raw intensity. The medieval tavern may be gone, but its spirit lives on wherever people gather to share food, drink, stories, and the fundamental human experience of being alive in a world that is both beautiful and terrible, promising and threatening, full of both hope and despair. And perhaps that is the ultimate truth about medieval taverns, not that they were simply dens of iniquity or centers of community, but that they were profoundly human institutions that reflected the full complexity of the human condition. They were places where people came to be themselves, for better or worse. And in doing so, they created a legacy that continues to resonate with anyone who has ever sought refuge from the world in the company of strangers who might, for a brief moment, become friends. But there's more to this story that needs to be told. Beyond the violence, the gambling, and the daily survival, there existed layers of medieval tavern life that reveal even darker truths about the human condition in those brutal times. Let's talk about what happened to the children in these establishments. Not the customers' children safe at home, but the ones who lived in the tavern itself. The offspring of serving wenches and unknown fathers. The abandoned infants left on tavern doorsteps by desperate mothers. The young boys and girls sold into service by families who couldn't afford to feed them. These children grew up in an environment that would horrify any modern observer. They learned to walk on floors soaked with ale and blood. Their first words were often curses heard from drunk patrons. They fell asleep to the sounds of violence and paid little attention to the transactions happening in the rooms above. By age 5 or 6, they were working, carrying drinks, emptying chamber pots, luring customers inside, or serving as lookouts for criminal activities. The tavern keeper's own children, if he had any, occupied a strange middle ground. They had slightly more security than the orphans and bastards, but they were still trapped in a world that offered few paths to anything better. Sons might inherit the establishment, learning their father's mixture of business acumen and moral flexibility. Daughters might be married off to create business alliances, or they might simply become another generation of serving wenches, continuing the cycle. Education was non-existent for tavern children. The church ran some schools, but tavern keepers' families were often viewed with suspicion by religious authorities. These children learned through observation and experience, how to read a room for potential danger, how to spot a wealthy mark, how to fight when cornered, how to lie convincingly when questioned by authorities. These were valuable skills in their world, but they were skills that trapped them in that world forever. The diseases that flourished in medieval taverns deserve their own chapter in this grim tale. We've mentioned the general filth and contamination, but the specific illnesses that ravaged these establishments were truly nightmarish. Typhoid fever spread through contaminated food and water. Dysentery turned taverns into charnel houses during outbreaks. Tuberculosis, called consumption then, passed from person to person in those crowded, poorly ventilated spaces. The plague, when it came in waves throughout the medieval period, found perfect conditions in taverns. Rats nested in the thatched roofs and walls. Fleas jumped from person to person in the cramped sleeping quarters. The disease could sweep through a tavern in days, killing customers and workers alike. Some tavern keepers would try to hide plague deaths to avoid being shut down, dragging bodies out at night and disposing of them secretly. Others would stay open even as people died in the rooms upstairs, desperate for the income that kept them alive. Leprosy was another constant fear. Though not as contagious as once believed, lepers were social outcasts who sometimes sought refuge in the most desperate taverns, establishments so degraded that even a leper's coin was welcome. The sight of a figure with missing fingers, rotting flesh, and covered in sores sitting in a tavern corner was not as uncommon as we might hope. Sexually transmitted diseases were epidemic in establishments where prostitution flourished. Syphilis, when it arrived in Europe in the late 15th century, spread through tavern populations like wildfire. The disease's progression was horrifying, starting with sores, advancing to rashes and lesions, eventually causing madness and death. There was no cure, no effective treatment, only suffering that could last for years. Mental illness in medieval taverns is another dark chapter. The period had no understanding of psychological conditions. People suffering from what we now recognize as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, or PTSD were simply called mad or possessed. Taverns often became dumping grounds for these individuals, families would abandon them there, villages would drive them out to seek refuge in the anonymity of tavern culture. These mentally ill patrons occupied a strange space in the tavern ecosystem. Some were treated as entertainment, their ravings and strange behaviors amusing the crowd. Others were exploited for labor, given menial tasks in exchange for scraps of food. A few were treated with surprising kindness by tavern keepers or regular customers who recognized shared humanity beneath the madness. But most simply survived day to day in conditions that only worsened their psychological torment. The suicides that occurred in and around medieval taverns were more common than historical records suggest. A man who had lost everything gambling might hang himself from a tavern beam. A woman trapped in prostitution with no escape might drink poison. A soldier haunted by battlefield memories might walk into the winter night and never return. These deaths were often covered up, suicide was considered a mortal sin, and the body of a suicide victim would be denied Christian burial, sometimes mutilated and buried at a crossroads with a stake through the heart. The presence of magic and superstition in tavern culture adds another layer of darkness. Cunning folk, practitioners of folk magic, often operated from taverns, selling charms, love potions, curses, and hexes. Some were simply con artists exploiting the desperate and gullible. Others genuinely believed in their powers and practiced rituals that blended Christianity with older pagan traditions. Witchcraft accusations sometimes originated in tavern disputes. A business rival might accuse an alewife of using magic to make her ale more appealing. A rejected customer might claim a serving wench had cursed him. These accusations could lead to trials, torture, and execution. The medieval justice system was brutal in its handling of suspected witchcraft. The tavern, as a place where social boundaries blurred and tensions ran high, was fertile ground for such accusations. The connection between taverns and organized crime in medieval cities was more extensive than earlier described. In major urban centers, criminal guilds operated with sophistication rivaling legitimate businesses. These organizations used taverns as headquarters, recruitment centers, and money laundering operations. The tavern keeper might be a guild member himself, or he might simply pay protection money to avoid having his establishment destroyed. These criminal organizations controlled various illicit trades, stolen goods fencing, contract violence, extortion, smuggling, and even early forms of human trafficking. Young people who arrived in cities seeking opportunity might find themselves recruited or coerced into criminal service, with taverns serving as the initial point of contact. The romanticized notion of honorable thieves and noble outlaws had little basis in reality. These were brutal organizations that exploited the vulnerable and eliminated anyone who threatened their operations. The political dimensions of medieval taverns also deserve attention. These establishments were places where sedition could flourish away from the eyes of royal authorities. Plotting against the crown, organizing rebellions, spreading revolutionary ideas, all of this happened in tavern back rooms and shadowy corners. Spies and informants were everywhere, some working for the crown, others for rival nobles, all of them reporting on who said what to whom. During times of political upheaval, taverns could become extremely dangerous. A carelessly spoken word criticizing the king could result in arrest and execution for treason. A stranger asking too many questions might be an informant. The tavern keeper had to walk an impossible line, appearing loyal to the crown while not alienating customers who might harbor rebellious sympathies. The final darkness we must confront is the sheer hopelessness that permeated much of medieval tavern culture. For every person who improved their circumstances through tavern connections or lucky gambling, hundreds more spiraled downward into deeper poverty, addiction, violence, and despair. The tavern offered the illusion of escape from medieval life's harsh realities, but for most, it was simply another trap. People drank themselves to death slowly, their bodies failing from alcohol poisoning and malnutrition. They gambled away everything they owned and then everything they could borrow, ending up in debtors' prisons or forced into indentured servitude. They caught diseases that killed them slowly and painfully. They made enemies who eventually caught up with them. They simply wore out, used up by a system that valued them only for what it could extract from them. And yet, even in this darkness, there were moments of genuine human connection. Friendships formed between unlikely companions. Acts of kindness occurred when someone helped a stranger in need. Love, however complicated and imperfect, bloomed in the most unlikely circumstances. Music, laughter, and joy could be found even in the grimmest establishments. These contradictions define the medieval tavern's true legacy. They were places of extraordinary cruelty and unexpected compassion, grinding exploitation and genuine community, utter degradation and profound humanity. They showed us what people are capable of at their worst and their best, often simultaneously. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can appreciate the complexity of these institutions. They were not simply good or evil, civilized or barbaric. They were deeply, messily, completely human. And in understanding them, we understand something essential about ourselves, our capacity for survival, our need for connection, our ability to find meaning even in the darkest circumstances. The medieval tavern is long gone, but the questions it raises about human nature, social justice, survival, and community remain as relevant today as they were 6 centuries ago. Sweet dreams.